Welcome to Thuma Mina Teaching. Thuma Mina Teaching converts the South African school curriculum into captivating video lessons and distributes them free of charge on familiar platforms like Facebook and on YouTube. If you have a look at these platforms, make sure you check the description below. In the description, you will find access to presentations and self-marking assessments that accompany the video lessons. In this particular session, we are going to tackle grade 9 history for term 2, which revolves around the Cold War. This session will consist of a few video lessons, and after every video lesson we are going to discuss some questions regarding that video lesson. So make sure that you have a pen or paper ready, or better, your social science workbook, as the video lessons are interactive and engaging. So quickly go and fetch that and be prepared for this session. Welcome to your final grade 9 history lesson for term 2. In this term we covered a lot of aspects of the Cold War, as you can see behind me. You might have missed some of these lessons. You might be watching this on television. Be sure to visit our YouTube channel. On our YouTube channel you'll find all our resources published for free, and you can watch these resources as many times as you wish. You can also visit our website and all our content would be there as well. In this lesson we are going to look at the arms race and the space race, and we're also going to end off the term by sharing some stories that happened during the Cold War. The Cold War was a very interesting period of time, and there were very interesting stories, and we're just going to end off by sharing some of these stories. So let's start with the arms race and the following inserted video lesson. In this lesson we are going to look at nuclear weapons, but we're going to put it in perspective with the broader history of weapon technology. And when we look at history, we would see that nations always try to be first in terms of weapon technology. This list is in no specific order. Let's start with chariots, this mobile platform, and there can be an archer on top of this mobile platform. It changed warfare completely. The crossbow was a very small, very effective, very powerful weapon, so much so that it was outlawed in parts of Europe during the 11th century. Let's move over to the trebuchet. The trebuchet changed siege warfare. It was very effective against castles. And then we can move over to gunpowder. And gunpowder, in my opinion, was the biggest jump in weapon technology. It just changed everything. If a nation was in front with gunpowder, it was miles in front on the battlefield. And then we can move over to cannons. Cannons transformed warfare completely on sea and on land. A very powerful piece of artillery that can be used miles away from the enemy. And then tanks. Tanks became the central part of armies, first used in the First World War. The English used it against the Germans, and apparently it was very effective. Tanks went through major advancements, and we can see it in the Second World War when we look at a tank like the Tiger tank, the most feared tank in the Second World War. This tank of the Germans was apparently so effective that it would, on average, destroy 11.5 tanks before they lose one Tiger tank. Very effective tank. So arms technology is a very interesting topic. We can talk about it for a long time. And why talk about it in the first place? It's to put nuclear weapons in perspective. You put it on that list. But should be on its own list completely, because it was so different. The devastation that nuclear weapons brought was just on a new scale. You can't even compare it. Nuclear weapons brought so much destruction that it was not only feared by the opponent, but by the rest of the world, because it has so much power. I made a short compilation of real footage of nuclear bomb tests, just to give the idea of how powerful these weapons actually are. when it comes to the Soviet Union and the USA, they found themselves in a new era of warfare. And previously, before nuclear weapons, if two nations had so much tension against each other, physical warfare was likely to happen. But not in this case, because with the nuclear weapons, it changed everything. So you might ask, was it not an option at all? Did they know it won't happen? Not at all. It was a possibility, and therefore they continuously prepared themselves for war. They would try to develop stronger, more accurate nuclear weapons that can travel further and obviously more powerful. During the course of the Cold War, more than 2,000 nuclear tests were made, which is quite devastating. In 1961, the largest bomb ever tested, the Tsar Bomb, was tested by the Russians. This bomb, just to give you an idea, was 1,400 times bigger than those that fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It was so big that the shockwave of the explosion went around Earth 3 times. From the point of explosion, 800 kilometers further, windows were shattered due to the shockwave. Today you can even look on Google Maps and see the crater of the Tsar Bomb. So the question arises, where will it stop? And both of these nations came to the point of MAD, mutual assured destruction. And what that means is that both nations knew that if they would go into warfare, that will mean complete destruction on both ends. And on this point, I think it's good to mention that it was not only those two countries. The USA formed a pact with many other countries, which was called NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. A few years later, the Russians followed and formed an alliance, the Warsaw Pact. And if you look at this world map, the dark blue are countries that formed part of the NATO organization, and the dark red countries formed part of the Warsaw Pact. The light blue countries are the countries that affiliated themselves to the USA, and the light red countries affiliated themselves to the Russians. And so you could see that if physical warfare actually erupted between those countries, it would have been a third world war. So what were the key takeaways from that lesson? First off, we know that the arms race basically refers to weapon technology between nations over time. But when we refer to the arms race, specific the arms race, we refer to the arms race between the USA and the USSR during the Cold War. The second takeaway is that in the arms race, the discovery of nuclear weapons was a colossal, massive jump in weapon technology, and that changed the landscape of warfare completely and forever. And which brings me to the third point. The third point is the term mutual assured destruction. We're going to talk about that again. And then lastly, the fourth takeaway from that lesson is the establishment of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and the Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact was, you can say it's the version of NATO for the Soviet Union. And it's called the Warsaw Pact because it was signed in Warsaw in Poland. So let's start with the first takeaway from that lesson, how nuclear weapons fit into the timeline of weapon technology. And the reason why we started with that in the lesson is just to consider nuclear weapons on its own. If you just start with that, you have to see it in perspective of weapon technology over the course of history. And you can just see that it is completely different. It's a massive jump. And in my opinion, the previous massive jump that could be compared would be gunpowder, that was first discovered in the middle of the 800s, 1850, around there, and then first used in warfare in the 900s, and then rapidly used in warfare much later on. So I like to use analogies of metaphors, and the way I can explain this is just to think about a highway. And I'm sure many of you have driven on these 4, 5, 6 lane highways, and then there will be a slow lane, and once you move into the next lane, it's faster and faster and faster, and usually the one lane at the very end is the fastest lane where the fastest cars can drive. And in the same sense, a little bit, if you jump in weapon technology, it put you in a different lane. And when it comes to nuclear warfare, it just puts you on a different road for that matter. So as I mentioned earlier, when we talk about the arms race, we talk about the period after 1945, as 1945 nuclear weapons were discovered or first used, and from that point onwards it's called the arms race, because the USSR and the USA both really focused their attention on developing more nuclear weapons, more accurate nuclear weapons, and also more powerful nuclear weapons. And not only the USA and the Soviet Union, also many other countries joined into this pursuit, but it was predominantly the Soviet Union and the USA how they competed against each other. And that brings us to that third takeaway, MAD, mutual assured destruction. And let's just talk about that for a second. Basically, it came to that point where both countries saw or realized that if warfare would happen, both countries would be definitely destroyed, and there will be massive destruction. And the term MAD was they started using it in the early 1960s, and as they used it, also the term helped as a deterrent to actually proceed in warfare. And there were these slogans and deterrents, and MAD was one of them. And it is true that if warfare would have happened, it would have been detrimental, not only to the Soviet Union and to the USA, but much wider. Why do I say that? If we look at the fourth takeaway, we see that there were two organizations, NATO and the Warsaw Pact. Now, these two organizations were allied countries that worked together and formed opposing forces. Now, this is a trend. If we look at the First World War, just before the First World War, there was two groups of allied powers or countries that grouped together, and then warfare happened. And the same happened with the Second World War. The Axis powers and the allied powers, they formed two groups, and then warfare happened. And the same sense here, NATO was formed and the Warsaw Pact was formed, but warfare luckily didn't happen. And the question is, why did it not happen? There was also a lot of tension, but warfare didn't happen. And it comes down to the destructive force of nuclear weapons. If warfare would have happened, it would have been so detrimental. So I'm going to jump over to a graph and to a map to just discuss two concepts further. Okay, let's move over to the world map. As you can see, the grand scale of the Cold War, most countries were aligned either to the Western powers or the Eastern powers during the Cold War. We've got dark blue and dark red. Dark blue indicating NATO members, that's the Canada, the USA, and Western European countries. And then dark red, the Eastern Bloc and the Soviet Union. And then we've got lighter red. These are the countries that were aligned towards the USSR, and then the lighter blue are countries that were aligned towards the USA or to the Western aligned. Now, this is interesting as it changed over time. These two countries, the USA and the USSR, they tried to gain influence in many other countries across the world. And so you'll look at the following map that is 20 years later, 1980. So many of these countries that were aligned to either the USSR or the USA changed over time and aligned themselves to the opposite or the other power. And as you can see here, this is a map of 1980. That's the map of 1962 and the map of 1980. And you will see that there is quite a change of the amount of countries that started supporting or aligned themselves to the other power. We are going to move to this graph over here. This graph indicates the power struggle or the race, the arms race between the USA and the USSR. The USSR is indicated in red as usually and the USA in blue. And what you can see here is the amount of the number of the warheads, nuclear weapons that they had or developed over during the Cold War, this era here that you can see here. And you can really see the struggle or the race between these two powers. And then finally, I would like to visit this website, Our World in Data. and there's a lot of information regarding this arms race. I want to show you this image over here. We've got nuclear explosions since 1945. Remember, this is not during warfare, but these are all tests. And what I want to show you here is that many other countries also participated in the development of nuclear weapons. Even South Africa we've got there. And these are all the tests done all across the world, and you can see it is quite devastating, the amount of tests that were done over this period of time. In the next part of the video, we are looking at the space race and how the Soviet Union and the USA had this race to see who would make the most major advancements in space. So the competition between Russia and the USA went further than the arms race itself, which brings me to the space race. The space race aimed to expand the influence of the nation beyond the atmosphere, which is quite remarkable if you think about it. Today, satellites is something that is common, but those days, to have your influence expand beyond the atmosphere was something quite incredible. The USSR was first with this space race when they launched the Sputnik 1 in 1957. This was the first satellite to orbit the Earth. The next year, the USA followed with the Explorer 1. The year after that, in 1959, the USA launched Explorer 6, and the Explorer 6 took the first photo of the Earth. That same year, 1959, the USSR sent Luna 2, and Luna 2 reached the surface of the moon. And later that year, they sent Luna 3, and Luna 3 took a photo of the back of the moon. In 1960, the USSR sent Belka and Strelka, 2 dogs, beyond the atmosphere. The year after that, the USA sent Hum, a chimpanzee, to space. The same year, 1961, the USSR really pushed the boundaries and they sent a person, the first person outside the atmosphere, Yuri Gagarin, and the USA saw that they were behind in this space race. And that same year, JFK, President of the United States, said that they will be the first people on the moon. Quite a bold promise that he made, but they actually achieved it. Within 10 years, in 1969, Neil Armstrong and Edwin Aldrin were the first people to walk on the moon's surface. This marked pretty much the end of the space race, and if you ask who won the space race, most people would say it was the USA because they had the people on the moon. But if you look at the broad timeline, the USSR was in front many times, but it's a debatable subject. When it comes to the Cold War, it wasn't only the arms race and the space race. Whatever these two nations did in competition, it was more than that competition itself. Athletics or chess or gymnastics, if there was a participant of the USSR and a participant of America, the world looked differently at that event. So we're going to end off with stories. The Cold War is known for so many interesting stories that happened, particularly in Berlin and in Germany. So let's enjoy these stories. So where are we? Europe was divided, Germany was divided, and Berlin was divided by the Cold War. East versus West, communism versus capitalism. And many people wanted to move from the east to the west, specifically in Berlin, from the eastern side to the western side. If you want to know why they wanted to move, look at lesson 6 again, where I discuss it in more detail. From 1945 to 1961, it was relatively easy for people to move from the eastern side to the western side of Berlin. But everything changed when that wall was erected. At the beginning, it was still quite easy in 1961 when there was only a barbed wire. People were able to cross over, and when the wall was erected, people went to buildings that were close to the wall and jumped out of the window into the more free Western Berlin. But these easy methods stopped quickly when the Soviet Union intervened and tried to stop all the easy ways of exiting Eastern Berlin. From that point forward, you had to risk your life if you wanted to flee East Berlin into West Berlin. And these are the stories of the people who managed to do so. I would also like to mention here, it started with a wall, but it became more militarized. And as it became more dangerous, people's attempts to escape East Berlin became more creative and more daring. Let's start with a couple of stories that happened at the checkpoints. Now first, what were the checkpoints? The checkpoints were places within the Berlin Wall where people were allowed to cross from east to west and from west to east. But not any person was allowed to do so. Only if you had a very special passport you were allowed to cross, like diplomats and high-ranking officials. The most famous of these checkpoints by far is Checkpoint Charlie. Checkpoint Charlie is also the place where the standoff happened in 1961 when the tanks of the Soviet Union faced the tanks of America, and they had a standoff for about 16 hours. A very tense time between the two nations. But let's get back to the stories. At these checkpoints, people frequently changed cars and transformed cars so that people were able to be smuggled through to the other side. And how did they do it? Let's look at these examples. The Trojan Mini. This little car was transformed. They took the inside of the seat out, and so they put a person within the seat and they smuggled the person through the checkpoint. And then the next car, this small BMW, is so small the person who owned the BMW argued that there's no chance that a border control guard would even check this car, because how could somebody even fit? And the person was seated within the exhaust of the car. And then the following example is also quite creative. This person took a surfboard and he made it hollow on the inside in such a way that a person could lie within the surfboard and put it on top of the car, and hopefully the border control guard will not search a surfboard for a person inside. And then Heinz Meixner did quite a 007 move. He took a car, a convertible car, put his fiancée in the back seat of the car, and his fiancée's mother, so his mother-in-law to be, he put in the boot of the car, and he took out the front windscreen and deflated the tire so it could be very low. And then he rushed through the checkpoint, because the checkpoints had these booms. And what he did is he rushed underneath the boom so that the border guards would not be able to stop him. And then one of my favorites, Wolfgang Engels, very creative and daring person. What he did is he befriended the guards, and especially the guards who owned a type of tank vehicle or armored vehicle. He asked them, hey, how does this car work? And he managed to actually have a quick driving lesson just for the fun of it. And they thought it was innocent, the border guards, but when they went on their lunch break, he climbed into the armored vehicle and he rushed to the wall, hoping to break through the wall. He didn't manage to go completely through the wall, and he had to climb out, and he climbed out the wrong side of the wall. Then the border guards started to open fire on him. He got shot twice, but he still managed to get through the wall, and he managed to reach West Berlin. And then, of course, tunnels. Many tunnels were built during the Cold War period in Berlin, but these tunnels were unfortunately more unsuccessful than they were successful. Only 300 people escaped through tunnels during the whole period of the Cold War. I would like to share two stories. Tunnel 57 started with Joachim Neumann. What he did is he got hold of a special passport that he actually borrowed, probably a bit forged, and managed to get through the border control to the western side. Leaving his girlfriend behind on the eastern side and his friends, he made a promise that he will make a way for them to get to the eastern side. He then gathered some student friends over time on the western side, and they started digging from the west to the east. The first tunnel was flooded, it was unsuccessful. Then they built a second tunnel, and this tunnel was discovered by the Eastern border guards, their intelligence. So the second time also failed. But the third time they managed to get to the eastern side, and many people were able to be freed through that tunnel. Unfortunately, it's difficult to let people know from the eastern side that there's a tunnel because there were undercover police everywhere. But 57 people escaped, and that was the largest amount of people that escaped through one tunnel. Then the following tunnel is Tunnel 29. Tunnel 29 is an extraordinary story, very interesting story, so much so that they might make a series on this story. The same people who created Chernobyl is possibly going to make a series on Tunnel 29, so look out for that. If you're a history junkie, go to BBC and type in Tunnel 29. There are a couple of podcasts on this story, and there's also a whole article. I don't want to give any spoilers, but it is a very, very interesting story if you want to take the time to go check it out. Besides the escape attempts through the checkpoints and through the tunnels, there were other people who were very creative and daring through other means of escape. Let's start with the hot air balloon. There were two couples that decided to make a homemade hot air balloon. Quite daring. What they did is they took bedding and they would knit the bedding together so that it would form a massive hot air balloon, and then they made a machine to produce hot air so that it will fly, and they were actually able to cross over from east to west after two failed attempts. There's actually a movie made about this called The Night Crossing. The next story is also very interesting. Harry Detterling escaped via train. He noticed that there is one train track that goes from east to west Berlin, obviously covered by fences and not used at all. Then he decided to become a train driver, and he made sure that he will be placed close to that track, and then he arranged to change the track to that old track that is not used, and he got his family and his friends on the train, and he went full steam through the armed border, and he called the train the last train to freedom. We hope you benefited from this video lesson. Our vision at Thuma Mina Teaching is to accelerate access to quality education. And our dream is to see learners across South Africa flourishing academically. We are a non-profit company and we are entirely dependent on public support. We produce lessons at the rate at which they are funded. As soon as a lesson is funded, it is published to the entire growing audience of Thuma Mina Teaching. Please consider taking hands with us in one of the following ways. Share our content with others that can benefit from it. A great way to support us is to find us on My School and to add us as your beneficiary. And consider donating towards a lesson, or ask your company's CSI department to partner with us. We are a PBO, so your donation is tax deductible. Our contact details you'll find on our website www.tmteaching.co.za. If you want to reach out to us, please email us on admin@tmteaching.co.za.